Welcome back to Global Perspectives in Climate Migration. My name is James K. Holder II. Today we're going to be talking about Module 2, which focuses on chronic heat and infrastructure breakdown, how those two things go together. So this module is going to focus on the physical science of extreme heat and how it impacts social systems. So we're talking about failures due to climate change that can sort of have impacts that are adverse and also disproportionate to different communities, particularly those who are vulnerable. So we're going to cover a term called heat island effects, which is one that you might be familiar with, especially if you're from a major city. We're also going to talk about how being in a marginalized or low income community can drastically impact your ability to avoid complications due to extreme heat. And we're also going to talk about cooling systems that, when challenged by extreme heat or lack of reliability of power grids, can create other cascading effects in communities. The chart on the right is showing something that's pretty drastic and somewhat alarming. In 2024, NASA charted July 22nd as the hottest day recorded on Earth. Yes, which is very alarming. So this is something that is obviously going to factor into what we're talking about today, which is extreme heat, which is when persistent over a certain area or span of time. We can also call it chronic heat. So vulnerability to climate stress is not distributed equally. As we just discussed, socioeconomic conditions or factors make it much more difficult for certain types of communities or people who live in certain areas to navigate these types of challenges. Chronic heat is a key climate stressor, and it also challenges infrastructure in a way that drastically impacts migration. So we'll talk about that a little bit closer to the end of the session, but the two are absolutely connected. So in defining chronic heat, we want to make sure that, again, we know that it's a chronic threat, which means there's a slow onset. It is basically determined by sustained high temperatures and that are often intensified when in urban areas. So that persists beyond a normal heat wave. So if you think about a heat wave as something that can have a span of a few days or maybe a week or even a little past a week, chronic heat is going to be one that's elevated throughout a period of time, and it's not going to abate in the way that a typical heat wave would. And it's also going to be complicated due to the structural makeup of that community, which we'll see shortly. So now we're talking about urban heat island effect. And the chart on the right is from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, we know it as the EPA. And it's really illustrating sort of the compounding issues of urban heat island effect. What you see is multiple categorizations of structures or transects within a community. So you have sort of a downtown core, densely populated, lots of paved surfaces, lots of asphalt. And going out towards the end where you see rural areas. So the big difference is that you've got a lot of tree cover, a lot of canopy, a lot of shade in those rural areas that you don't have in the urban core. And the urban core is also compounded by those paved surfaces, the asphalt, the dark surfaces, and even elements of the structures of the buildings themselves that are absorbing heat at a much denser rate from the radiation of the sun. Not only does that heat absorption and lack of canopy create a higher temperature during the day, because heat has been absorbed into those surfaces, it's now radiating back out into the atmosphere over the course of the evening. So there's not really this relief of the sun going down or it getting cooler as you would expect towards the evening, and you have this persistent heat that's building up mounting over several days because of this heat island effect. And heat island effect actually encompasses other challenges. It basically makes it difficult. Not only does it increase the temperatures, it makes it difficult for the temperatures to come down. So the big causes of urban heat island effect replacement of natural land cover with pavement, buildings, and other heat absorbing surfaces. So this development that happens in big cities is really the major cause. You've got these dark impervious materials that store and re-radiate solar heat. And then also, just again, that lack of vegetation, the lack of tree cover is contributing to that additional heat. The impacts primarily include increased energy consumption. So that means if you live near to or within an urban heat island scenario, you're going to be using more energy to cool your home or your place of business. We also want to understand that that's a big drain on the power grid, especially since that tends to be concentrated within one area. The elevated emissions of air pollutants and greenhouse gases compounded with the heat creates an environment for additional respiratory challenges for those who might have issues like asthma, and even those who don't have those types of issues. You can begin to experience difficulty because of the temperature in combination with the greenhouse gases and other like emissions that exist in the city. So then you also have heat-related illnesses that add on to that respiratory illness or conditions or challenges. And those are elevated within vulnerable populations. So we're going to continue on to infrastructure breakdown. And again, we're talking about here power, water, transit, health services. Failures associated with these are not just as simple as an inconvenience. A lot of these can become life or death scenarios where people rely on public transportation, where people rely on electricity that provides power for hospitals or provides power for cooling centers or anything that people need the resources for. We want to really understand that when power goes out, it's really becoming an essential that's being taken away, not just an inconvenience of a power outage. And then beyond power, we've also seen in recent years, I know you've seen like on TikTok or like Instagram, examples of roads buckling, sinkholes, railroads buckling, causing different types of delays or even crashes in the rail systems. These are things that, coupled with strains on the water supply or strains in other areas, they're creating these big challenges for communities, especially in an urban context. And according to Weissman 2021, just one of your reading sources, they stress that cooling is infrastructure. So we don't want to look at something like air conditioning in a public cooling sense, or the ability to cool through power or electricity, reliable electricity, as a luxury. We don't want to look at it as a convenience. We know that it is an essential. As temperatures continue to rise, it's something that is necessary for people to live, survive, and thrive in their homes. So again, not just a luxury. Power grids are most vulnerable in extreme heat. Transmission efficiency drops by 8% while demand surges. So when we're talking about here, in addition to the added demand for the electricity because of the heat, we're also seeing that the efficacy of that transmission of electricity drops. So everything is basically slowing down because it's kind of too much pull on it. It's making everything harder and more difficult to share with those who need it the most. In a global context, we can look at infrastructure breakdown as something like the big Phoenix heat wave of 2023, which actually kind of predated 2023, where there were hospital surges, infrastructure stress, and outdoor worker mortality. Continuing on to New York City. New York City is very familiar with this type of blackout scenario, these things. But in 2019, we're talking about cooling center overloading and also mobility disruption. And we know, again, mobility in New York is really where the majority of citizens are taking the subway. And so when you have a breakdown of that system, it can become very chaotic, very disruptive, beyond just an inconvenience. And then in California, we have farm worker health crises throughout sustained heat. In Delhi specifically, which is in India, we're seeing extreme heats with sort of grid failure and water scarcity um, due to drought. And then even in Europe, we're seeing extreme heat waves that are causing massive amounts of casualties and fatalities. So what I want to really point out here in this slide is that where in the previous module, we were really talking about and focusing about the vulnerability of the global south. But what you really want to understand here is that the global north is also vulnerable. There are also lots of vulnerable areas in the global north, in the United States, in Europe even. And so we don't want to be thinking of it as just a problem for the global south, but this, I believe, is a challenge that we recognize as one that is universal. So the key themes here are that disproportionate these disproportionately impact the elderly. Issues of like heat, elderly have conditions that make it harder for them to deal with heat. Their bodies don't process or sort of trigger signaling to know, okay, it's too hot. I need to go downstairs, or I need to turn a fan on, or I need to drink some water. And I say that as a general, but but we know that as you age, your thermal sensation changes, it shifts, it often becomes weaker. And so what I mean is that you really don't have the same ability to determine of your own sort of agency that you are too hot. So heat issues become a much greater problem for the elderly. In addition to the oftentimes fact, unfortunately, that many elderly find themselves in denser cities, denser populations because of economic reasons. We're looking at the intersection of heat and housing. Urban planning inequity becomes a challenge. We need to know and understand where those things intersect. That proximity to urban heat island effect and the cost of and access to power and electricity, reliable power and electricity, is something that is a challenge in many parts of our country and around the world. So there are so many adaptive measures for urban heat island effect, and we kind of keyed into that earlier, but things like green roofs, you can do reflective roofs on the surfaces. You can have more planting of more trees, more greenery, and more small parks within different communities. So there's a lot of different things that can be done. They do take some time to come into effect and have the result that you want. But we know that there are effective measures to combat urban heat island effect. Also governance gaps. So, we know that these risks exist, but oftentimes there's not a intervention from a policy side that can help resolve some of these issues. And we'll also talk about a little bit of how heat and policy kind of intermingle from time to time as well. So here's that other time. This is a quick discussion about interconnectedness of the heat and the infrastructure breakdown. So beyond infrastructure, chronic heat magnifies and intensifies the impacts of acute threats. So we're talking about things like wildfires are amplified when there is persistent heat anyway. And also there are types of storms that are amplified when there's persistent heat or heat waves. So health crises, system failure, water system failure, power loss, these are all things that fall into that, again, that category of infrastructure collapse. And imagine when there's other layers of public service in need on top of that. Think a recent pandemic. Think situations where anything that's added on top of the existing infrastructure can make things that much more chaotic and strained. The picture on the right is from the New Yorker from the time of Hurricane Sandy when it hit New York. And it says, vote here. But I want to highlight that this summer, I was actually on a call with a group of sort of grassroots voting rights activists. And their big concern at that time was that at the same time, there was a mayoral election in New York. There was a massive heat wave in New York. And if anybody has been to New York, spent time in New York, you know the buildings in New York are very old. It's like Europe. They don't have oftentimes built-in air conditioning. So one statistic that I found staggering was that over half of the official polling locations in the city of New York do not have air conditioning. They don't have central air conditioning. So they were really concerned that this heat wave was going to be a form of voter suppression, that it was going to keep people from voting because they couldn't risk standing in line or they couldn't risk standing in the polling locations that were too hot. It becomes a discussion of, is this happenstance or is this negligence? Is this something that we have known about and could have prepared for in order to preserve voting rights? Or is it something that just, you know, it's just a coincidence that there's an election, which, or a primary rather, which happens in the hottest part of the year, and this combination effect. So it's something to keep in mind how these things are not isolated. And as interdisciplinary as the study that we do in this group, is going to be important for you to be open-minded about connecting those dots and being intentional about seeing how one thing can affect the other, even if it's not necessarily spelled out in the text or spelled out in something that we say in the lecture. So our case study is going to be about the Phoenix heat waves. And this is like the chronic heat story, but this was a very significant heat wave in Phoenix with temperatures approaching 120 degrees Fahrenheit for many days. We know that one of the big documented concerns about heat and health is about temperatures that are sustained over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, let alone sustained over 110 degrees Fahrenheit for a duration. So you can only imagine. So what happened? There was environmental stress. The heat extended beyond safe limits and nighttime temperatures stayed elevated. Again, we're talking about that heat island effect compounding the issues of chronic heat, making it so that there's no relief even throughout the evening from high temperatures. The grid is pushed because of cooling demand, as well as transit and degradation of surfaces of streets and rail surfaces. So being also a public health emergency is also straining the hospital resources and care resources. We've got more hospitalizations, more deaths due to extreme heat. And then we've got another effect of the reduction of productivity of outdoor labor. So these are all things that create this cascading effect that really not only impact that community, but then when you start talking about agriculture, it impacts the economy of that region and also the availability of goods and produce throughout the country, really, and abroad, oftentimes. So one thing to take away from this story is that adaptation can be a form of migration. It doesn't have to be about displacement every single time. It doesn't have to be that, oh, someone had no choice but to move. So that's climate migration. Sometimes people are making a choice based on this persistent heat or, understanding that something happened once, it'll probably happen again, it'll probably happen again. And at some point, you have to take action. So non-disaster climate impacts can erode a city's livability over time, and that's again what we're seeing. Over time, we're going to see a reduction of the population of these types of cities when these events happen because people are planning for their future. They're understanding, oh, I don't want to live through this, or I may not be able to live through this in the future. This chart here unfortunately shows the ramping up of the number of deaths in Maricopa County, which is basically Phoenix in Arizona. And so from 2023, we're seeing 645 deaths due to heat-related illness. And that is a large number. So, and it's only ramping up more and more, but it's almost 10 times as much from 10 years prior. So it's a really, really accelerated pace of death that is approaching in these regions. And so those types of numbers and figures are going to force people out. So the lasting lessons are heat governance needs to integrate into infrastructure policy. Migration can be preemptive, driven by gradual habitability decline. And again, what we saw in the last slide, we're understanding that it is not always this, okay, big shift and there's always all these people move. It can be a gradual thing that causes people to leave an area. And that's actually something that could make it more challenging to track migration from one area to another. So in conclusion for this week's module, the key takeaways I want you to leave with are that chronic heat acts as a slow onset hazard. It's not about like a single event, but it strains everyday life. Infrastructure systems are interconnected to many types of threats, but specifically chronic heat. And grid failures cascade into transit and cooling and health crises. Vulnerability is not evenly distributed. And we know that those who are impoverished, those who live in the urban core, oftentimes, and many who are the elderly have greater challenges when dealing with something like chronic heat, whether it's because of access to transit, access to cooling, access to reliable energy for cooling, or otherwise. Those things make it harder for people who were already marginalized to sustain in those times. And next week, we'll be looking at Module 3, which will focus on drought and water scarcity and how that impacts displacement. All right, thank you.